Iran was going through a period of demanding nationalization of its oil resources. That's a very important episode with Mossadegh, whom you might have heard about his name. Dr. Mohammad Mossadegh, who was the prime minister and the national charismatic leader from 1951 to 1953. Prior to that, he was a famous parliamentarian. But this period, he was the prime minister of Iran. And he nationalized the Iranian oil industry, and the British didn't like it at all. And eventually resulted in a famous coup, which at least partly was supported by the funding and by the moral support of the British and the Americans, particularly by the Americans. It was always seen as one of the earliest and the most successful CIA operations during the Cold War.
So CIA had something to do with it?
Yes, of course. That's one of the earliest operations of the CIA.
Wait a minute. What was? Yes, of course. What was the CIA? What was the CIA doing?
CIA. This is the time at the post-war era
in the 50s.
In the 50s, 40s, and the 50s. Mm-hmm. The British Empire, which was really the major superpower of the region after the collapse of the Tsarist Empire, gradually took the second seat to the Americans, who were the newcomers and the great powers and the victors of the Second World War. And the Americans viewed Iran as an important country, since it has the largest common borders with the Soviet Union. And it was, the South was the Persian Gulf, which at the time was the greatest supplier of oil to the outside world. And therefore, the Americans had a particular interest in Iran. And in the earlier stages, their interest was in the interest of the Iranian government, because they wanted to get rid of both the Soviet Union, which made a return in the post-war era, and of course the British that were gradually withdrawing from Iran. But they had a full control over the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. They changed the name to Anglo-Iranian Oil Company when the name of the country officially changed from Persia to Iran. In the West, the name of the company changed. And they got into a huge dispute with the Mossadegh government that eventually led to the coup of 1953, which eventually created a very distressful memory in the minds of many of the Iranian nationalists, that this was the betrayal of the great powers, the British and Americans. Yes, CIA played a part, because CIA feared, contrary to the British that they were afraid of their own oil in Iran, the CIA was afraid of the Soviet penetration in the South, and particularly because there was a very powerful communist party in Iran, the Tudeh Party of Iran. So they gradually shifted between the Truman administration and our Eisenhower administration. These are early days of the CIA. Mm-hmm. And then they actually did participate to send their agents. There's a long story to that. And it eventually resulted in a successful coup that removed Mossadegh from power.
What's the United States interest here? Why are they using CIA? Are they trying to make sure there's not too much centralization of power in this region?
They were afraid of the fact that of the Soviet Union, and during the Cold War, that was their concern. The only concern.
They actually almost want to protect Iran and its own sovereign processes from the influence of the Soviets.
Yes, because they were afraid of the fact, if Iran, or at least this is part of the, I'm simplifying a very complex picture, but the Americans basically were thinking that if Iran is going to be lost to Soviet influence, then eventually basically all the oil resources in the Persian Gulf are going to be threatened.
Yeah.
And this would basically is the national security of the United States and all of the Western allies, European allies. So in a sense, this was the long arm of the CIA to try to make sure that that's not going to happen. And then, of course, they were persuaded by the British. Because British were the old hand, which were in Iran since the beginning of the 19th century. They always had relations with Iran and so forth. So they gradually replaced. Of course, I don't want to give them this kind of a satanic view that Americans was a bad influence, because they had also some very good influences in Iran. But this particular episode somehow shed a dark light on the American presence and was used and abused time and again, particularly the revolution 1979, which was this great Satan idea that Khomeini created. Basically was based on the fact is 1953, you were responsible for the downfall of a national government in Iran, which, as a matter of fact, he had no respect for it. Khomeini had no respect for the secular national liberals, including Mohammad Mossadegh. But he was using it as a rhetorical tool for his own purposes. But what happened is that after 1953, we see again the rise of authoritarian Mohammad Reza Shah's power.
And that's the Shah?
That's the Shah that we know as Shah. This is the son of Reza Shah.
And technically, what is Shah?
Well, Shah is an old term in Persian that comes from a pre-Islamic Persian of ancient times.
So in the context of democracy, should it be seen as like a supreme leader, king?
Is the head of the executive power, according to the Constitution of 1906.
Oh, that's in the Constitution, the actual term
course,
Shah.
He has a place in the Constitution.
But the actual term Shah, okay, interesting.
But the Shah is a very old term.
It's almost like a monarchic term, like
it is.
Like a king.
Yeah, it is actually is a term peculiar to Iran. I've written about it somewhere. But because the term that the Western world in the ancient times has been Rex for royalty and the king. In the Eastern world, in India, is Raj, is the same origin, the same root. Iran never shared that. They had the idea of, because Rex and Raj, I don't want to get into too much of a etymology, but this is an interesting one.
Yeah.
Rex and Raj both means the one that opens the road for basically enforcer of religion. Okay? Enforcer of the right religion. Because Rex and Raj both have the etymological origin of right, you see, and right means the right religion, basically.
By the way, there's so much beautiful language here. I'm just looking at the Persian Constitution of 1906, and it says it's the Constitution of the Sublime State of Persia, Qajar, Iran. I mean, just the extra adjectives on top of this stuff is beautiful. I mean,
because that was actually the change that came about. I don't want to go too much into it, but it was called, as I pointed out before, the guarded domains of Iran.
Yes.
They changed that to the sublime state of Iran during the Constitutional Revolution, because they wanted to give a greater sense of centrality of the state.
Yeah.
And sublime was the term was used.
But also, what permeates all of this is a poetic. I mean, there is a history of poetry,
of course, very strong
to the culture,
very
which is fascinating. So, I mean, it's I of course I don't speak the language, but even in Russian, there's also a music to the soul of the people that presents itself in the form of poetry and literature in the way that it doesn't in the English speaking world. I don't know what that is. There's
yes, there's a romantic side.
Romantic side.
Almost, yes.
Romantic side. That's right.
Yeah, I agree with you. In Iran, of course, there's a time of the Constitutional Revolution is a time of great poetry. This kind of a patriotic sentiments that comes through poetry plays a very important part.
Yeah.
Of course, these days poetry has kind of declined. And instead, you see the visual image that it's at the center. That's why cinema is so important.
kids these days with their TikTok.
Yeah, let me finish this about the
Yes.
period of Muhammad Reza Shah. He built up because he received a greater income from the oil revenue, and he built up a very strong state with a strong security force, a strong security apparatus, which is the SAVAK, which is an acronym for the security force in security organization. And he, of course, unfortunately, in the 1960s and 70s, particularly 1970s, basically suppressed the voices of or possibility of any kind of a mass participation in the political process. It became very much an authoritarian regime with its own technocrats, very much a modernist vision of Iran's future, and almost kind of messianic that he was hoping that Iran in a decade would become the fifth most powerful state in the world and reaches, as he would have said, the gates of the great civilization. Very much in the mind had this image of ancient Iran of the Achaemenid Empire. And we want to go back to that greatness of the Achaemenid Empire. Somewhat rather naive and very nationalistic in a crude fashion. And what happened is that as a result, there was built up some kind of a resistance from the intellectuals, from the left, eventually resulting in a kind of a protest movement, as I said, by 1977, 1978. Then, of course, the question that comes to mind, and that probably you would like to know about, is the fact that why it becomes religious, why it becomes Islamic, if it's the popular, nationalist, liberal tendency of opening up the political space and allowing greater participation, going back to the Constitution of 1906, 1907, why it's all of a sudden it becomes Khomeini. Where does he come from? Mm-hmm. The reason for that, at least in a concise fashion, is the fact that on one area that after the greater suppression of all the other voices remained open was religion. Mosques, the mullahs on the pulpit, and the message that gradually shifted from the old traditional message of the Sharia of Islam, I mean, all the rules and regulations of how one has to live, into something very political. And not only political, but also radical political. Mm-hmm. So, in the whole period from the Constitutional Revolution to the Revolution of 1979, basically the religious establishment gradually was pushed to the opposition. They were not originally, they were very conservative, supporters of state, as the Catholic Church, for instance, was supporter of majority of the authoritarian governments around the world. But the politicization was the result of isolation, because they were left out of the system. And while in isolation, they were not successful in trying to reform themselves, to try to find answers to many of the questions of modern times. What happens to women? What happens to civil rights? What happens to a civil society? Mm-hmm. How the modern law and individual freedoms have to be defined in Islamic terms.
How to separate religion and state.
Or how to separate the religion and state. These issues were never addressed. What happened is that there was this bypass through political Islam and revolutionary Islam, as it gradually they learned, that this is the bypass to power, basically, to become again a voice in the society, and eventually a prominent voice, and eventually a monolithic voice in the society. That's the process that led into the revolution of 1979. basically this period. Greater attention was paid to religion, even among the secular middle classes, who were alienated for a very long time because of this extensive modernization of the Pahlavi period. They didn't have a sense of that old mullahs with their turbans, but they had a kind of an aura in this period. Yes, they are those who remained not corrupted.
Mm-hmm.
They are the people who basically went against the suppression of the Pahlavi regime. And Khomeini became a leader, a symbol of that. Nobody ever thought in the earlier stages, among these very excited multitudes that came to the streets of the Iranian cities in 1979 or 1978, actually, thought that this old mullah in its 70s that all of a sudden has appeared from the Najaf through Paris to Tehran is going to take over and create a autocracy, a religious autocracy.